Okay, so it's Cat Stanley Space Demon coming at you again, and today I want to talk a little punk rock, a little Sex Pistols. Now you might know the original lineup of the Sex Pistols was John Lydon, aka Johnny Rotten, on vocals, Steve Jones on guitar, Paul Cook on drums, and Glenn Matlock on bass. Now Matlock would be replaced by Sid Vicious before the release of the band's only album, Nevermind the Bollocks. And that's what I want to talk about today, Glenn Matlock's untimely departure from the Sex Pistols, which many believed hastened the group's demise, and the misunderstanding at the heart of his departure. Now let's get in a little bit to the formation of the Sex Pistols. In 1972, Steve Jones and Paul Cook had a band called The Strand. They were based out of London. They were still in their teens. And at the time, Jones was the vocalist. He was yet to take up the guitar. And they had a third bloke in the group called Wally Nightingale, who was handling the six-string duties. Now, the guys used to hang out at a clothing shop owned by Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood called Too Fast to Live. And late in 1974, McLaren would assume management duties of the band Strand, who were now joined by Glenn Matlock, who was an art student who occasionally worked in the shop, and that shop was now just called Sex. Now, Matlock would take on the role of bass guitarist, and by spring of 75, the band were rehearsing regularly and playing gigs. Now, Nightingale was sacked, and Jones would move from vocalist to guitar. A guy named Bernard Rhodes would oversee the band for a spell during the time Malcolm McLaren was in the States managing the New York Dolls. He'd returned to London in May of that year to shift his focus back on managing the Pistols. McLaren had planned to steal Dolls guitarist Sylvain and bring him to the UK to front the band, but when that plan fell through, Rhodes and McLaren were forced to resort to combing the streets of London, walking up and down the street, going up to random kids who they thought looked the part and asking them if they fancied themselves a singer. One such young man turned out to be none other than John Lydon. Seems that Rhodes liked the fact that the 19-year-old was wearing a tattered Pink Floyd t-shirt with the words "I hate" scrolled above the band's name on the front and was held together with safety pins. Lydon's audition consisted of him singing along to songs on a jukebox at a nearby pub. Guitarist Jones was really taken with Lydon's look. He had green hair at the time, and even though Rotten came off as kind of an asshole, he could tell he had intelligence, and it was Jones who'd christened him Johnny Rotten because of his really bad teeth. Now, an Englishman with bad teeth, imagine that. But anyways, so that was the band's lineup. It was all set with Rotten's on vocals, Jones on guitar, Matlock on bass, and Cook on drums. And the band immediately set about writing songs. Now, the band's primary songwriting team would consist of Matlock, who also played guitar in addition to bass, and Rotten. Now, with the exception of the duo's first collaboration, the song Pretty Vacant, which had lyrics by Matlock, Rotten would be the band's lyricist. But Matlock would be the one to come up with the band's riffs and chord progressions. He was the band's melody maker, and he was influenced by groups like the Small Faces, The Move, and the Beatles. In fact, McLaren would even remark half-jokingly that Matlock really liked the Swedish pop hitmakers ABBA. But it was this melodious sensibility that would often lead to clashes with Pistols guitarist Jones, who didn't care for Matlock's affinity for using what he called Beatle codes. So what would end up happening is Matlock would present Jones with a riff or a chord sequence that would be a bit too melodious or Beatle-y, and it would be Jones who'd take it and give it that harder Sex Pistols edge. But for all of the songwriting chemistry he may have had with Jones and Rotten, personality-wise, they couldn't have been more different. Matlock himself said that he and Johnny were like chalk and cheese. McLaren would later say that Matlock was probably too nice to be in a band like the Sex Pistols. And if you look at these old performance clips, you can see that Matlock does look out of place on stage with the other guys. They're really earnest and straightforward, balls out with their punk look and attitude. Matlock kind of just has this boyish face. He almost kind of reminds me of Davy Jones from the Monkees. He really looks like too nice a guy to be in a band. He really looks like the odd man out. So you can kind of see where McLaren was coming from. And then if you look at these clips of the Grundy Show appearance made by the Sex Pistols, you can see that Matlock kind of looks out of his element with all the other punk rockers on stage. But let's get to the misunderstanding that would ultimately lead to Matlock's departure from the group. So it wasn't enough that Glenn and John had such divergent personalities for a start, but the band's manager, Malcolm McLaren, was a master manipulator who thrived on chaos. He loved getting in their ears and pitting the two of them against each other. And for a rather effeminate Englishman, he was almost kind of like a schoolyard bully in that way. I'm sure we all knew people like that. You know, shit starters. Guys in school who tried to stir up shit between people to try to make them fight with each other. You know, kind of like mean girls. Now, Johnny Rotten said that he was led to believe at the time, and it was probably Malcolm who put this idea in his head, that Glenn Matlock was looking for a sort of Bay City Rollers type situation. And if you're not familiar with the Bay City Rollers, they were a Scottish group popular with teeny boppers, a bubblegum pop band who had big hits with songs like their chart-topping US hit Saturday Night. And Rotten said that he wanted to be part of something a little more hardcore. And Matlock would leave the group in February of 1977, 2 months after an ill-fated appearance on the Tomorrow program, hosted by Bill Grundy. On the show, band members Rotten and Jones would say the SH word and F words respectively. Jones would later refer to that appearance on that show, in which the group had appeared as a last-minute replacement for the band Queen. He'd refer to that appearance as the beginning of the end for the Sex Pistols. And that appearance would ultimately lead to them being dropped from their record label, EMI. Now, there's some debate surrounding Matlock's departure from the band. McLaren had originally announced that Glenn left because he went on too long about Paul McCartney. Of course, Matlock was a big Beatles fan, but Matlock insists he left under his own accord. And Jones has cited the fact that Glenn didn't have the right look. He just didn't fit in with the band. And it didn't help that he liked the Beatles. But Jones also lamented the loss of Matlock, saying they could have made more records if he'd have stayed in the band, and losing Matlock as a songwriter was a huge loss. Matlock himself cited his contentious relationship with Rotten as to why he left, exacerbated no doubt by McLaren's manipulative ways. It seems McLaren himself obviously wasn't the biggest fan of Matlock and has said disparaging things about him over the years. Of course, the band would carry on, with Rotten bringing on his close friend Sid Vicious to replace Matlock, even though Sid couldn't actually play bass. He was mainly brought in because of his look and his relationship with Rotten. Now, the band would go on to finish recording their sole album together, Nevermind the Bollocks, with Vicious. And despite the fact that producer Chris Thomas tried to do what he could to incorporate Sid's bass playing onto the record, his playing was so substandard that he wound up appearing on only 2 tracks, and they would end up enlisting Jones to handle the bass duties on the remainder of the album. Now, Nevermind the Bollocks would be released on October 28th, 1977 in the UK on Virgin Records, which signed the band after they'd been dropped by A&M, who'd picked them up following the unceremonious dismissal from EMI. A US release would follow in November, on Warner Brothers Records. Now, the album just missed cracking the Billboard 100 in the US, but would go on to top the album chart in the UK, and the record would go on to be highly influential on both sides of the Atlantic, with many punks and rock bands citing the album as a favorite and the group as an inspiration. Now, the band announced their split in January of 1978 amid increasing tensions and Vicious's drug use. Now, Vicious would die of a heroin overdose in February of 1979, shortly after his release on bail from Rikers Island Jail in New York City, where he'd been held in connection with the stabbing death of his girlfriend Nancy Spungen in October of 1978. Now, with regards to the misunderstanding that led to the breakup of the band, Johnny Rotten would later say that it would come to pass years later that the Bay City Rollers were not what Glenn was looking for, which is unfortunate. And I think it is unfortunate because Jones did say himself that had they not done the Grundy show and had Glenn not left the band, he felt the band had more records in them. But I think it was just Malcolm McLaren's penchant for manipulation and his lust for chaos that is what the band couldn't get over. Now, the original lineup would reunite for a 6-month tour in 1996, along with some mini tours in 07 and 08. They'd get inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2006. And I guess this past year, Cook, Jones, and Matlock toured the UK with a new singer, a guy called Frank Carter, who previously performed with the bands The Rattlesnakes and Gallows. But I don't know how you can tour as the Sex Pistols without Johnny Rotten. He is the Sex Pistols, but I suppose it was billed more as a tribute rather than an actual reformation of the band. And much has been written and talked about the dissension and hatred amongst the original band members, but Jones himself has equated it to a football team saying, even if I don't like you, I'll still pass you the ball. And Rotten has said they're really proud of each other, even though they never admit it. So that's the video on the misunderstanding that broke up the Sex Pistols. Johnny Rotten was under the impression that Glenn Matlock wanted the band to be the Bay City Rollers. Turns out that was bullshit that was put into his head by the manipulative bastard Malcolm McLaren, who was trying to create chaos. Turns out that's not what Matlock was into whatsoever. But that's the video. I hope you guys dug it, and I'll see you next time.
Who's here?